Have you ever felt triumphant after winning an argument, only to realize nothing truly changed? The mind of your opponent remains unmoved and the satisfaction feels hollow. Philosophers have long questioned the purpose and nature of arguing, often warning us against it. What if, instead of being a sign of strength, argumentation reveals our deepest insecurities and weaknesses? Let's dive into this philosophical perspective to uncover why arguing often exposes more about our flaws than our convictions. The fragility of argumentation. Arguments often arise not from a place of strength or clarity, but from a deep-seated need to dominate, convince, or affirm one's beliefs. Friedrich Nietzsche famously wrote, "The will to truth is a sign of weakness." This bold assertion invites us to examine the roots of our argumentative tendencies. Nietzsche suggests that the drive to impose one's perception of truth on others is not an act of intellectual rigor but a reflection of a fragile ego. When we engage in debates, we are rarely confined to the objective exchange of ideas. More often, we are defending something far more personal, our identity. Consider this: if your beliefs are truly unshakable, why must you seek external validation through argument? Genuine wisdom does not require external confirmation; it exists, serene and self-sufficient. This perspective resonates with the teachings of Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who counseled, "Seek not to contend in reasoning with everyone." Epictetus recognized that the compulsion to argue often stems from insecurity. A self-assured individual, confident in their principles, sees little need to engage in contentious disputes. To argue incessantly is, in many cases, to seek external affirmation of one's worth or ideas. At the core of most arguments lies the ego, a fragile construct desperate to assert its superiority. Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously observed, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." But these chains are often self-imposed. When we argue, we reinforce these chains, tying ourselves to the opinions of others. Arguing reveals insecurity. It's an admission that the idea you hold dear doesn't feel sturdy enough to stand without defense. This is why sages and philosophers from Lao Tzu to Socrates often remain silent in the face of provocations. Lao Tzu, for instance, taught that he who argues is often wrong. This wisdom reflects the understanding that engaging in disputes rarely leads to true insight. Winning an argument may momentarily inflate the ego, but it does little to foster growth or genuine understanding. In fact, it often distances us from these goals, as the focus shifts from seeking truth to preserving pride. To engage in endless disputes is to tie oneself to external validation, allowing the ego to dictate our actions. True freedom comes when we recognize that the need to argue is a chain of our own making, one we can choose to release. Throughout history, some of the greatest minds have recognized the futility of arguments as a path to truth. Socrates, the father of Western philosophy, famously avoided confrontational debates. Instead, he engaged in dialogue through his method of questioning, what we now call the Socratic method. His aim wasn't to prove others wrong, but to guide them towards self-reflection, revealing contradictions in their own beliefs. This approach shifts the focus from ego-driven clashes to a shared journey of discovery. It is an act of humility, prioritizing wisdom over victory. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher and Roman emperor, offered a striking perspective on the matter in his Meditations. He wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." To engage in arguments is to stoop to the level of those who thrive on conflict, revealing not strength but vulnerability. For Marcus, self-mastery was the hallmark of true power. By refusing to argue, one demonstrates a profound control over the ego and acknowledgement that one's worth is not diminished by others' disagreement. The wisdom of these philosophers converges on a common truth. Argumentation is often less about truth and more about ego. When we argue, we risk losing sight of the higher goals of wisdom, peace, and understanding. Instead of engaging in conflict, these thinkers invite us to embrace silence, self-reflection, and dialogue rooted in curiosity rather than contention. This perspective challenges us to rethink our impulses to argue. What if instead of debating, we ask questions as Socrates did? What if instead of convincing, we cultivated insight? And what if, like Marcus Aurelius, we sought mastery over our reactions, letting go of the need to respond to every challenge? In rejecting arguments, these philosophers didn't abandon truth. They elevated it, showing us a path that transcends the need for validation. Why silence is powerful. Silence, often mistaken for weakness, is actually a profound statement of strength. By choosing silence, you demonstrate mastery over the ego and the ability to rise above petty disputes. Consider the example of Pythagoras, the ancient Greek philosopher and mathematician, who valued silence as an essential discipline. In his school, initiates were required to remain silent before they were allowed to speak, cultivating the wisdom to listen and observe without the distractions of ego-driven chatter. This practice reflected the belief that silence is a precursor to true understanding, a space where insight is born. Pythagoras' reverence for silence aligns with the timeless wisdom of the Tao Te Ching. Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. This insight reminds us that silence often carries more weight than words. To choose silence in the face of provocation is not to retreat but to rise above, demonstrating a higher level of self-mastery and understanding. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus also emphasized the power of restraint, teaching, "If anyone tells you that a certain person speaks ill of you, do not make excuses about what is said of you, but answer, 'He was ignorant of my other faults, else he would not have mentioned these alone.'" Here, Epictetus suggests that silence in response to criticism reflects not weakness, but wisdom. By refusing to engage in argumentative force, we free ourselves from the need for external validation and instead focus on inner strength. To transcend arguing is to operate on a higher plane of understanding. It is to recognize that truth does not require defenders. It simply exists, unshaken by the noise of disputes. Silence then becomes an act of confidence and clarity, a declaration that one's self-worth and convictions need no external affirmation. The weakness in winning. Winning an argument may feel satisfying in the moment, but it often comes at a cost. You may secure a fleeting sense of superiority, but at what expense? Relationships are strained, egos bruised, and minds remain unchanged. As Michel de Montaigne put it, "We are all patchwork, and so shapeless and diverse in composition that each bit, each moment, plays its own game." Montaigne's insight reminds us that humans are not creatures of pure logic. We are ruled by emotions, biases, and experiences. Arguments rarely change these underlying forces. In fact, winning an argument often means losing an opportunity for genuine connection. Dale Carnegie, in How to Win Friends and Influence People, wisely noted, "A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still." Arguments harden positions rather than soften them. Constructive alternatives to arguing. Philosophy offers alternatives to arguing: dialogue, questioning, and empathy. When Socrates engaged in dialogue, his aim was not to defeat his interlocutors but to illuminate truth together. Similarly, Carl Rogers, a 20th century psychologist, emphasized the importance of active listening and empathy in resolving conflicts. Rather than arguing, consider seeking to understand the other person's perspective. Marcus Aurelius advised, "Whenever you are about to find fault with someone, ask yourself the following question: what fault of mine most nearly resembles the one I am about to criticize?" This practice fosters humility and self-awareness, dissolving the need for arguments altogether. Arguing is a sign of weakness, not strength. It reveals insecurity, ego, and a lack of inner peace. True strength lies in understanding, in transcending the need to prove oneself. As Epictetus wisely noted, "It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows." By choosing silence, dialogue, or empathy over argumentation, you demonstrate not only strength but wisdom. So the next time you feel the urge to argue, pause and ask yourself, what am I trying to prove? And to whom? In that pause lies the power to break free from the chains of the ego and to rise above the noise.